Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Cielle Heiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together. And today we'll be creating a short episode talking about who the four main asteroid goddesses are and how to use them when you're interpreting them in an astrological chart. So,
Yeah.
we can start by talking about Ceres. I'll
Okay.
also say we talk more about the asteroids in our episode why the asteroid goddesses should be treated as planets. So if you have more
Mhm.
curiosity about like the asteroids in the sky, like what are the asteroids, how are they named, I would definitely recommend you go listen to that episode
Yeah.
for more information.
Go
And
back
then
there first.
yeah. And then come back and we can talk to you about the four goddesses and their mythology and interpretation. So
Yeah.
starting with Ceres, who was the first asteroid named, and that's the Roman name for Ceres. Her Greek name is Demeter, which means Earth Mother, and she is a goddess that is associated with the cultivation and fertility of the earth and the ways that we are nourished by the earth. And so she is the goddess of agriculture, and she is the goddess that allows things to grow from the earth. And the myth that we have of Demeter, that where we learn the most about her, is the myth of Persephone's abduction by Hades into the underworld. And there are so many amazing sources that have done a lot of really great work telling that myth and unpacking it. And because this is a shorter episode, we're not going to go into the like nitty-gritty details of actually telling the whole myth out. But the main things that we can take away from that are that Ceres is a goddess who really reminds us that life is cyclical, right? That Persephone,
Mhm.
the way the myth ends is Persephone goes into the underworld and spends her winters there. And then when she returns above Earth, um, Demeter has been mourning Persephone's absence and has not been allowing plants to grow during winter. And then Persephone returns in spring, and the crocuses and the other plants start to bloom as Demeter is overjoyed to be reunited with her daughter. And I have a prominent Ceres in my chart, and I live my life
Yeah.
quite cyclically and quite seasonally. So that can be one way that Ceres shows up, is connecting us to our cyclical natures. Um, and then Ceres can also really speak to relationships with parents in many different ways. They can speak to
Yeah.
really close devotional relationships with parents, and they can also speak to um, more difficult experiences and even experiences of losing children or having an overly controlling mother as well. But Demeter, that myth is really a myth of like, don't piss off the mom because nothing will grow
Yeah.
from the earth. Like the rage of a mother
Right.
is
Right.
hard to
And
beat.
yeah, and Ceres is the biggest asteroid, and it's
Mhm.
called the Great Mother, the asteroid itself. And that's it's said that that's why we have seasons in the first place, is when Persephone goes into the underworld, that's why we have winter. And so, yeah, I've definitely see it play out in a lot of charts of people who go through like custody battles for their own kids.
Mhm.
Typically when people have Ceres and Pluto in some sort of harsh aspect or conjunction or something like that. I also see it in charts of a lot of herbalists and people
Mhm.
who work with plants and people who love plants, or I even have a few friends who have plant shops and they have prominent series. Even just people who like plants. I've noticed that correlation come up a lot. People who like the earth, people who are nutritionists or work in those sort of food realms,
Mhm.
people who create or love to cook tend to have a prominent series as well. Yeah.
Yeah, Ceres really shows up with people who want to interact with plants in ways that are nourishing and nurturing because there's so many ways to
Yes,
interact with
that's a
plants.
strong distinction. Sure.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
I also,
Healing.
right, I have Ceres conjunct my ascendant. I am an herbalist, right? And I'm
Yes.
drawn to the plants that can nourish us and build us up and help us heal and protect
Mhm.
us. Like, roses are incredible medicine and I love pretty flowers, but I'm not planting my garden to have it be full of gorgeous flowers, I'm planting my garden to have it be full of nourishing medicinal plants. And like Lori said, like a lot of nutritional people focused on food. So that's a big distinction. And one thing that Demetra George talks about in her book about asteroid goddesses is that Ceres is the principle of unconditional love. And so wherever she shows up in your chart can speak to either places where you need to learn unconditional love, or where you might have, either experiences with or without that presence. And so that can be an interesting thing to reflect on as well.
Yeah, and I also tend to see Ceres, especially if she's not prominent. Like in my chart, she's not really doing a whole lot. She's not really making aspect to anything. But she is in Pisces, and I tend to see her as like what nourishes you, what nourishes your body, what do you lean towards? And since like, she's not prominent in my life, she is still in my 9th house, which is higher learning and travel and knowledge. And the most nourishing thing I feel like I do is travel. It's like adventuring and higher knowledge and learning. And typically when I do travel, I travel for conventions or festivals or conferences or like things to better or continue my education. Any trip where I'm learning and then also spending time in nature are like, I mean, I don't think I take trips besides that. I've taken like 3 trips in my adult life that like wasn't originally for knowledge and then like was staying a few extra days. So I mean, I do see it play out in that way for me. And I do tend to see like I've seen a lot of people with like Ceres in the 2nd house love to spend a lot of money, and it nourishes them to like bring nice stuff into their life, like just things like that. So yeah, I've seen many examples, but typically like, yeah, if Ceres isn't super prominent, I do tend to see it as just like a general nourishment.
No, that's a good way of looking at it. And the last thing that feels really important about Ceres is that she is the goddess who guides us through the Eleusinian mysteries. I apologize if I am pronouncing that word wrong. Greek and Latin are not languages that I speak.
No, it's right. Yeah, you're right.
And those were these ancient mysteries of the life, death, rebirth process that Ceres teaches us so much about, and Persephone as well when she goes to the underworld. And they were enacted for thousands of years in the ancient world, and they were this process that people would go through to come to terms with the realities of life, death, and rebirth, and connect with the mysteries of existence. And so Ceres in your chart, especially if you have a prominent Ceres, like I have Ceres on my ascendant. My ascendant ruler is conjunct Pluto. I also have Mercury on my ascendant, who was involved in that myth. He goes to the underworld and helps communicate. And I have Adonis as well on my ascendant, who is Persephone's lover. And so like underworld mythology and traveling the underworld, very prevalent in my life, and being able to interact with grief, to interact with loss, to kind of go to the profound depths of things and get, incredible power from them. Like these are also kind of Pluto keywords in some ways too, but Ceres definitely calls us into that life, death, rebirth process, and the wisdom that we can gain being familiar with that.
Yeah, and I have the Persephone asteroid on my sun too, so not quite what we're talking about, but still definitely a big part of it. Yeah.
And sometimes you'll see multiple asteroids from the same myth showing up in a little conglomeration, and you're like, oh yeah, that's a prevalent myth in that person's life.
They're definitely playing out similar stories for sure.
Great. Well, should we talk about Vesta then? Or do you have more to say about Ceres?
No.
Okay.
We can move on.
Cool.
Do you want to go first?
No, you should go first.
Okay. Do you actually want to show the map here? I feel like this is a good place to put that little chart up. Yeah, so Vesta is said to be the Virgin. And Juno, I always like to talk about Vesta and Juno as a little bit of a pairing. That's kind of like what helped my brain wrap around them. And I think this chart really helped me understand them a lot as well. This was from Mitra's book, The Asteroid Goddesses too. But Ceres is the IC. So since we just talked about her, I'll just start there real quick. She's the kind of like innermost self at the bottom of the chart. But Vesta is the Virgin. And when I was reading Demetra's book, like I really started thinking a lot about the word virgin and that like Virgo-esque energy. Because it's such a misunderstood and very misused word in our society today. Because everybody sees it as like as virginity, as sex, as like when you lose that for the first time, but that's like really not where that word stems from, and what it means at all. And I could come back with a better definition or even read a portion of Demetra's book, but it really talks a lot about how it's about making choices and doing what feels aligned with you. And so when I think about Vesta, like I think about the ascendant, the body, the sense of self, and it's less of like what are you holding back and like keeping for yourself or savoring or saving, but like what are you doing to nurture yourself? What are you doing that is going to bring you the most joy and abundance and all of those type of things. And what I think was really striking to me when I first started really researching Vesta and Juno as that kind of opposition type of energy. Vesta is on my descendant, like 2-3 degrees off. And Juno is only a few degrees away from my Mars, which is 6 degrees away from my ascendant. So not quite conjunct my ascendant, but conjunct Mars, which is like conjunct my ascendant on the other side. So I would definitely say like I have these two switched. And we'll talk about Juno in a few minutes, but she kind of speaks a lot about partnerships. So there's this like differentiator between your sense of self and your soulmate, your partner, in those two. And Vesta is your spiritual flame. It's your fire. It's the thing that you're so excited about. But when I look for Vesta in a chart, I almost see her as like, where do you not mind being alone? And what, like, not even not mind, but like, where do you thrive being alone? Like people who have Vesta in the 4th house might just want to live alone. People who have Vesta in the 10th house, like, might want to work alone or own their own business. That might be really important to them. So Vesta just tends to, it really shows a lot about your flame and the things that you're so passionate about and like how you can better those things and work towards those things. And like, going back into that like nurturing energy, that nurturing word, like what does bring that energy, but also like where do you maybe need a little bit of extra solitude? Like maybe having people's opinions doesn't necessarily help you. And seeing it be 3 degrees off my descendant with I also have the Uranus Neptune conjunction exact in my chart, and it's 3 degrees away from my descendant on the other side. So that was something that made a lot of sense to me when I first read into it, because I've historically felt lonelier in partnerships than I felt on my own and never really understood why that was. And I think Vesta for me was one of those big like aha moments of like, oh, this is why like I'm not always looking for partners. And this doesn't just have to be romantic partners too. I think this can bleed into other things. But I need a lot of space and solitude, and I need the ability to work by myself, but then invite partners in on my own terms when I want them there, because it's very important to me to work with people and to have partnerships and to have friends. And like, I get my best work done with other people. I have an 8th house stellium. I need people. I need that like intimacy almost. But at the same time, I like really have to honor that Vesta placement by understanding that I need to do most of my work alone, and then just invite people in when I feel safe and comfortable to do so.
Hmm.
So that's kind of what Vesta means to me, at least,
Yeah,
and how I've seen it play out for other people.
that's great.
Did
And
you? Yeah.
to really bring it to the baseline, Vesta is the sacred hearth fire.
Mhm.
So when I'm
Yeah.
cooking, like I'll be praying to Vesta because she is my oven.
Mm.
And she, you know, we said this in the
I
last
love that.
episode, but Vesta was the first of Saturn's kids to be born. And in that myth, you know, Saturn
Hmm.
eats all of his kids. And so then she's the last one to come back out. But she's ancient, right?
Yeah.
Like the hearth, people have always gathered around the hearth, around the sacred flame. And so
Yeah.
she is such an ancient primordial goddess
Hmm.
who's also in many ways universal, like across time and space. We all have relationships with the hearth and with flame and fire in our
Yeah.
lives. And there's a component of Vesta of the eternal flame too,
Hmm.
because in ancient Rome, we had the Vestal Virgins who were really esteemed members
Yeah.
of society who had a very important role of keeping the eternal
Mhm.
Vestal flame burning. And they
Right.
would face extreme punishment if they didn't keep the flame burning. And also, if they broke their vows of virginity, they would literally be buried alive. And
Sure.
one of the reasons for that that I think is really interesting is when we trace Vesta's story back farther before Rome, and Demetra does a lot of great work of this in her book on the asteroid goddesses, you see that
Hmm.
Vesta was really involved in much more ancient like fertility and reproductive rights, and that
Yes.
the Vestal priestesses would actually
Hmm.
engage in sacred sexual acts. And then if any of them got pregnant, that baby would then be the next in line for like the royal like leadership lineage. And so then when you
Yeah.
get
And
to Rome and when you get to the patriarchal like emperor structure, you then
right.
understand why the Vestal virgins are punished so extremely if they're not chaste, because if any of them ever were to get pregnant, their baby would be such a threat to the
Hmm.
patriarchal power. So Vesta also tells
Right.
that story of shifting from a matrilineal way of organizing ourselves to patriarchy, which is also interesting. And you can see how that may show up in how you experience Vesta in your chart, or like different people
Absolutely.
experience Vesta.
And adding to that, if you've seen the movie Midsummer,
I haven't.
there's a scene where they would almost like choose a man to just go impregnate the women, so that their little culty society would just like have more children. Like that's how they would bring in the next generation. Um, but they used to do that, and Demetrius' book talks about that too. They would just like put their men in the rooms at random. And so if they did get pregnant, they didn't know who the father was, but they
Mm-hmm.
always knew who the mother was. And I think that's like a really important thing to think about, because when the patriarchy started taking more control, um, women were forced into marriage originally so that men would know who their children were. And
Mm.
that was such an important piece of why marriage was the way it was, and how the word virginity actually changed
Mm-hmm.
in the first place, which is like really crazy, because it used to have such a completely different meaning, and
Totally.
that's just
Just
one
like,
of those like, yeah, they were just like, no, not that anymore.
and I much prefer the much more ancient understanding of virginity as belonging to yourself.
Absolutely.
That doesn't mean that you can't have sex. It just means you belong to yourself.
Right, right. And yeah, it's like it's what's important to you. And as you can see, the glyph is a fire as
Mm-hmm.
well. So
Mm-hmm.
it really is just like what brings out that spiritual flame and that energy. Like, what do you love? What do you need? But also, how do you find your own peace? And how do you what can you do that sometimes separates you from everybody else? And that's okay too,
Mm-hmm.
like when I see people with strong Vesta placements, I'm like, well, this just might be the area of life that you need to do alone. And that's
Yeah.
okay. Like just accepting that.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, let's move across the mandala and talk about Juno
Absolutely.
a little bit.
Yeah, very similar energy, but
Yeah. And
opposite.
so Juno, oh, and then Vesta in the Greek pantheon is Hestia as well.
Hestia,
So
yeah,
just
yeah,
for people to trace that. And then Juno
yes.
is
Hestia
Hera.
has her own asteroid too, if you're
Mm,
curious too, as does Demeter.
yeah,
Demeter.
and Ceres. And
Yeah.
that can be fun to look up the different, I mean, there's 28,000 asteroids, so maybe a different
Yeah,
version
there's
of
more.
the myth shows up.
Yeah,
I mean, there's
absolutely.
2 million asteroids, just 28,000 named ones, but okay.
Yeah.
Juno in the Greek pantheon is Hera, and
Mhm.
she is Zeus's or Jupiter's wife and also sister.
Mhm.
Um, and
Yeah.
Juno really speaks to like marriage and fidelity and partnership, and also the issues that can come from that, right? Because if you're familiar with
Mhm.
Greek mythology at all, Zeus is off just like being terrible to everyone and
Yeah.
sleeping with everyone. And Jason Hawley has talked about how we can
Mhm.
reimagine the ways that Zeus's like infidelity is told in stories, that maybe he's just really queer and really polyamorous, and the like old white guys who are writing down these myths didn't have a way to understand his orientation to the world, and so they wrote him down
To
as this
word
like
it.
terrible like rapist pillaging like all of these nymphs and women and goddesses. um
Yeah, yeah.
but regardless,
Misinterpretation.
the way that the myths come to us, it's framed as though Jupiter and Juno have this like vow of being in marriage and being together. And then Jupiter only gives Juno a few kids. Like most of Jupiter's children are with many
Mhm.
other entities and beings that are not Juno. And Juno
Yeah,
always stays faithful to
faithful.
Jupiter. And it enacts like terrible retribution to a lot of the women who Jupiter is sleeping with, and is very
Yeah.
vengeful about that. And so yeah, it can really speak to the complexities of marriage, but also the ways that we may feel
Yeah,
limited
the
within the
realities.
systems. Yeah, like we might be in this reality or this
Yeah.
system, and it's not congruent with what our desires or our needs actually are.
Yeah, and when I first started studying Juno, I just remember somebody at some point when I like first got into the asteroids was like, "Oh yeah, Juno's your soulmate. Juno's your partner. It's your soulmate." And then I started looking into Juno and I was like, "How is this a soulmate?" Like Zeus used to throw like fire at her. He would throw his little lightning bolts. Like they would get in these huge fights, which is like, isn't that where thunder and lightning came from? Like it's
Yeah, it's
like
like, oh, Jupiter and Juno are like fighting
literally
in the sky again. It's a
right,
thunderstorm.
right. Like that's literally what a thunderstorm is. And it's like, well, why would I want that type of partnership?
Yeah.
Right? Like where does that come in? Um, and so that was something that as I started to research it, it was almost like the societal pressure of like what women had to go through.
Hmm.
And you know, like the silence that she was forced into. And
Hmm.
she just had to sit back and like watch her husband not be faithful to her, but she had to be faithful to him. And so there's just so many versions of that story where it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But then still so many people see Juno as the partner and the type of relationship that you should have.
Mm.
Yeah, which
And
is such an interesting one.
one thing that, Lori and I both attended a Mythic Asteroids retreat with Demetra George.
Mhm.
And one thing that Demetra was saying at that retreat is that Venus in your birth chart can speak to what you're attracted
Yeah,
to,
I was just gonna say that.
but
But
Juno speaks to who you can live with. And so if your Venus
yeah, and
and
maybe what you
Juno,
need.
yeah. So if your
Yeah,
Venus
and
and
that's a
Juno
big
are
drift.
doing different things, then like you
Yeah.
might be really attracted to people who you could never actually spend your life with, and it speaks to different nuances
Yeah.
in that way.
Right, right. And you know, it's kind of like the what you want versus what you actually need or what you
Mm,
could actually be with. And you know, for some people those are very different things. To some people those are blind spots and to some people those are things that get along fairly well. Mine are trying each other sign, not by degree.
That's nice. Same element at least.
Same element, yeah.
And then one other thing kind of with the history of Juno too that Demetra talks about in her book is, you know, we've talked about how these goddesses are all so much older than the like Olympian
Yes.
pantheon. And we talk about that a bit in our last episode as well. So go back and listen to that if you're curious about that. But Juno, Demetra talks about how, you know, the matrilineal like group of people who were worshiping Juno, when the Zeus worshiping barbarians came in, you can look at Juno's marriage to Jupiter as her sacrificing herself to save her people. And so it's like things needed to change, like
Yes.
they're being conquered and colonized, and, you know, shifts need to happen in their lives because of that. And so Juno giving up, you know, she was the one goddess who ruled, and then she gave up her power and got in this marriage with Zeus in order to save her people. So Juno can also talk about those levels of sacrifice that we sometimes have to make in partnership with others.
Absolutely. And related but unrelated, I do remember reading something at one point that was saying that during the Me Too movement, there was a pretty strong Vesta and Juno conjunction, I believe. And I
Very
think
interesting.
Saturn or something, Venus or Saturn or both, or Mars or something was involved in it too. And Pallas, I think, was involved too, because that can be like fighting for a cause. But I just remember thinking like, oh yeah, like that makes a lot of sense, right? Like women speaking out for things that, you know, we've been treated certain ways for so long and had to be silent. And then it felt like there were also some people who were just kind of like, well, you know, why is everyone speaking out now? And it's like, well, it took a few to be like, hey, this is not okay anymore. And then everyone else was like, oh, wait, this has happened to me also. Like, you know, it literally, like, that's where that came from. It wasn't just like everybody wanted to be part of something. Everybody already was part of something. And people were finally just like speaking up about it, which is like such a Juno thing.
That is so
If you really think
interesting.
about it.
It's also so interesting to look at transiting asteroids and how they show up.
Yes.
So that's a really great example.
Absolutely. Yeah. That was super interesting for sure.
Should we, anything else about Juno, or are we ready to move on to Pallas Athena?
Anything else?
I mean, there's so much more
I guess,
we could say.
I know. I was gonna say just like to hit on the like how to translate it in your chart thing one more time. I have seen people see like obviously it's like what you might need from a partner or who you could live with or what might be realistic. But I've also seen people say it could be like where you meet your partner as well.
Interesting.
And like speak a little bit more on that.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, I don't have too many examples of it, but I have heard some stories and I know that some people translate it that way. So
well, if anyone
I'll just
has
put
any
that out there.
examples, please send them to
Yeah,
us.
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
Cool. Pallas?
Pallas Athena. So one distinction I want to make is that the three goddesses we just talked about are all sisters, and they're all the sisters of Jupiter or Zeus and Hades or Pluto. I'm not sure all of the boys actually in that pantheon. Is Neptune also one of their siblings, I think, but they're all siblings. So they're all like pretty related. Whereas Pallas Athena is Jupiter or Zeus's daughter, and she actually is born from his head.
His knowledge.
Yes, his knowledge. And she's very associated with knowledge and wisdom. And, you know, ancient Athens was a city that was very like erudite and intellectual and had Pallas Athena as their, you know, guardian goddess. And so she's very much the principle of like focused intelligence, but she's also a warrior goddess, and like she beats Ares in a fight in one of the myths, and she's very involved in the Trojan War, and she's, you know, this powerful, wise, intelligent warrior goddess. And she's also like Jupiter or Zeus's favorite I guess Zeus, really, when we're talking about this mythology, she's like Zeus's
Yeah,
favorite
Zeus.
daughter. And so there's things there as
Right.
well about like relationships with fatherhood and your parent.
Yeah.
Well, not fatherhood, but relationship with fathers. And like maybe like some daddy's
Authority
girl
figures.
complex sometimes,
Yeah.
or an issue with authority as well. Um,
Yeah.
so those are just some general things about Pallas.
Yeah. And I think something that really resonated with me with Pallas, because I have her at 5 degrees Aquarius and I have my son at 7 degrees Aquarius. Um, Something that really resonated was the fact that she was born and then she like ran around with all the boys, right? And none of the boys took her seriously because she didn't want to do the girl things. She wanted to do the boy things. She wanted to compete. She wanted to be taken seriously. She wanted to be seen as an equal. And that's all she wanted. She just wanted to be a person. She just wanted to be an equal and be respected. And you know, that wasn't too much to ask for, but she just wanted to be one of them and none of them respected her, so she worked so much harder than everybody else and proved herself over and over again and ended up beating them all. You know, she beat Aries, like you were just saying. Like she has, there's all these stories of like her just really pushing ahead and like proving that she was the best. And then instead of the boys taking her seriously, they almost like turned on her and they just look at her and they're like, why'd you have to do that to us? Like, why'd you do that? And they were like mad at her for it. And that was a big part of her story that, you know, I really sat with for a long time because she's like, well, I finally proved myself to you, like you
Mm.
said. And now instead of seeing me as a threat, you're like, well, I can't fight a girl. You know, you're a girl. I can't fight you. And they just went so far the other way. And then there's just this whole like, what is femininity versus what is masculinity, and why
Mm.
can't we just be people? Like, why
Yeah,
why
like
can't I just be a human? And yeah, that's definitely a theme that I've felt like I've dealt with. Just like trying to exist and like be taken seriously. And then, you know, when you become better than the people that didn't see you as a threat, and then now all of a sudden you're a threat, they're like, you know, I can't hit a girl.
mm-hmm.
And so just that whole energy of like people turning on you, um, and just like feeling like you always have to prove yourself and that masculine energy. But also Pallas is the warrior, so she
Mm-hmm.
speaks a lot about having to stand up for a cause. And I've seen her, you know, she was also prominent in the Me Too movement. We'll have to look up the chart for that because I don't remember what exactly
Mm.
was going on, but I do remember seeing it and being like, wow, that's crazy. Um, but yeah, she is fighting for something, right? Like she's standing up for the cause, and a lot of people who are very like philanthropic, very prominent Pallas, people who start movements and people who fight for things. I've definitely seen her play out in charts of like really prominent, powerful leaders as well.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Alice
And
tends to get a lot of attention for the things that she knows and teaches and her
yeah,
wisdom.
like she's
Yeah.
esteemed, right? She was Zeus's favorite
Right.
daughter.
Right.
And there's a thing too there of Pallas, you know, like she's born of a man. She's literally born of
Right.
Zeus's head.
Wow.
And there's pieces in her mythology, especially the later versions of her mythology, when we get to more patriarchal Greece,
Mm-hmm.
um, of her rejecting women and rejecting femininity and trying to, you know, play with the boys and be with the boys and be more
Mm.
masculine, and her being kind of misogynistic in that. And there's dynamics
Yeah.
too, you know, where like women can hate women and we can definitely perpetuate like gender issues on each other, even though like we're not men. And Pallas Athena can speak
Yeah.
to that as well, of her kind of rejecting more feminine ways of being and supporting like the patriarchal power structure that supports her.
Yeah. it's like that whole argument. I know it's going around TikTok a little bit, but it's like the I'm not like other girls type of energy. And it's
Yeah,
like, well, why not? You know, especially in the past year with things like Taylor Swift popping off and Barbie becoming as big as it did. It's like the women in the industry are really and Beyonce was so big this year too. Like I just know like women really like saved the economy, and
literally.
a lot of men like can't handle it, right? And so it's been really interesting to kind of watch things like that play out, and a lot of women saying like, you know, I am like other women and that's okay. Like,
Hmm.
you know, the whole
Yeah.
not like other girls thing doesn't have to be like an archetype anymore. um and that's been really cool, I think, in the past couple months to like watch that change and watch women band together and, you know, watch the Barbie movie really be like so strong in
Hmm.
doing that. And hearing so many people, I mean, I myself attended 3 of the Taylor Swift concerts. But hearing so many people talk about how safe they felt at them um was so powerful as well. So yeah, just like
Mm-hmm.
it's that like women banding together type of energy,
Yeah.
which I know is a little bit of a tangent, but it's related.
No, totally. Yeah. And so Pallas Athena can really speak to, like, if it's prominent in your chart or someone's chart, it can really speak to your relationship
Yeah.
with these weird gendered norms and the sort of
Yeah.
weird roles that women in a patriarchal society, or people socialized as women, or people presenting as
Yeah.
women also, um, like the different ways that we need to navigate weird gendered things and the ways we grapple with that. And then Pallas Athena, she can also speak to our intelligence, what we fight for. She can speak to tomboy energy as well, like we said, like
Yes.
daddy's girl energy. So those are just some of the ways to work.
Yeah.
And again, with these
Just
archetypes, it's like it can be either end. So like maybe you're a tomboy, or maybe you like are the opposite of a tomboy and you have a prominent Pallas, or maybe you're, daddy's girl, or maybe you have this really difficult relationship with your dad, right? So it can speak to different ends of the
yeah.
spectrum, but it's the fact that like those mythic
Right.
stories, those aspects, those threads are playing out in your life in some way.
And I think that's really important too, to note that like when you talk about those extremes, it's always one or the other. And at oftentimes in your life, it's one or the other. You know, like you could have
Well,
a really close relationship with your father when you're young and then grow up and be like, wait, you were never there for me.
yeah.
So and you know, you can argue that with anything, but everything is always going to be a spectrum,
And
and
that
these characters play out the extremes. Yeah.
And that's kind of one way, we can interpret natal charts different than transits, is when you have this prominent in your
Right.
birth chart,
Right.
you will hopefully have a very long life to live out this mythology and these archetypes in many different ways throughout your life. Just like your Venus or
Right.
your Mars are going to show up at different ways at different times. Whereas like a
Right.
transiting experience with Pallas, you might only have a few sides of that archetype show up because you don't have as much time to sink into it.
Right. Right. And that's something I was thinking about recently, because I do solar return charts too, and I was just thinking about how interesting it is that like in a solar return chart, I swear this is related, and you have 1 year to play out the entire story that the chart is trying to say, whereas like in your personal birth chart, you have like your entire life. And so there's a huge difference between those two things. And having your entire lifetime, like sometimes things are really important and prominent and sometimes they're not. And more often than not too, I also want to note that like different things in your chart are going to kind of say the same thing. There's going to be a lot of themes. And
Mm-hmm.
you know what we were talking about in the last episode about how my chart is like all masculine except for my Venus. I also have Pallas directly on my sun. So like, you know, I'm not a very feminine person, but I have had extremes where like, you know, I did have a phase in college where I wore heels and dresses and makeup and like got really into like feminine things. I was in a sorority. I like did all those things. But then I was like, I don't like this. I don't
Mm.
like putting this much effort into it. I wanted to be more focused on my knowledge and then the things that I cared about. And I found acro. I just wanted to play around outside in the dirt barefoot. And, like I've had so many different extremes with that as well. So,
Mm.
and I also do want to say another thing. Pallas represents the MC, or your public side of yourself, versus Ceres being the IC. So that's just kind of another aspect of like Pallas is the way that sometimes you want to be seen or noticed.
Mm. That's a great distinction.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Lots of
Well,
different thoughts, but
so many thoughts. And we'll put different
many thoughts.
resources in the show notes where you can go learn more about the
Yeah.
asteroid goddesses. This is just, a quick overview of kind of our understanding of them, how to work with them. But I mean, all of these goddesses could have hours long episodes just talking about them. Because now I'm thinking about like the
Yeah.
Medusa mythology and Pallas Athena. And like, there's just so much we could talk
Yeah.
about that we don't unfortunately have time for
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. And we're gonna do more episodes too on just general asteroids and
Yeah,
all of this stuff
there will
too.
be lots of, and how, chart examples, how they show up. Again, if you have any
Yeah.
prominent asteroids in your chart and you would love to share examples with us, we'd love to hear from you and love to hear how, the asteroid goddesses show up in your life. And, the way we work with, especially these 4 asteroid goddesses, like we talked about in our last episode, we treat them as planets. Like these are sacred
Yeah.
ancient goddesses, and they're just as important as like Pluto or Neptune are. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, that's, they're just really exciting goddesses to work with. If
Yeah.
you are new to them, I'm excited to see how you'll like how they'll show up in your chart for you. If you're familiar with them, I hope we are able
Yeah.
to give some new insights from our understandings.
Yeah, and feel free, of course, to reach out with questions
Mhm.
or share your stories, or if you want a rating on them or anything as
Yeah.
well.
Well, how can we reach you,
Yeah.
Lori? What do you have any offerings related to
Yeah.
this?
Yeah, so I, like we were talking about, use at least these 4 always as planets, and Chiron as well. So all of my work heavily, I always talk about them. I don't separate them from the planets. But I am starting to offer some more general asteroid readings. So reach out for questions or anything on that. My website is LoriKaufman27.com. My Instagram is LoriK_127. And trying to think if there was anything else. But yeah, I guess
I
for
think
now.
if there is, you'll see it on your website.
Yeah,
Lori always has
it's
like a
all on
million
there.
things
So
going on.
I always have so many things going on. In my Instagram, I do have a like upcoming events tab too.
Mm.
So, if you're ever looking for an event or something you want to attend, if you're local to Cincinnati or traveling through or want to attend online, all of that's in there too.
Awesome. And I
What about you?
I am on Instagram at Alicia Cielle, and my website is aliciacielle.com. And I offer herbal astrology readings where we can talk about topics important to you and different herbal advice and things that we can integrate in. I'm in the process of developing an asteroid reading, but if you are interested in talking about asteroids with me, just book a regular reading and put that in the comments, and I'll prep a reading for you based on the asteroids in your chart. And I also make astrologically personalized herbal teas for folks that are really yummy, personalized for your personal like temperament, astrology, priorities. I want help with sleep. I want help with focus, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how you can reach me and engage with my offerings.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you so much to everyone for listening to this episode. We'll be coming out with plenty more of stuff about the asteroids and about lots of other stuff related to astrology. So stay tuned.